Welcome everybody, friends, and everyone else on our social media and in the interwebs to Overland's first Diversity in Design Thinking series. This is a digital forum where people can voice their views on a wide variety of topics with design in mind. And we're super excited to be here and able to do this with everybody that we have at the table. My name is Greg Street. I'm a designer here at Overland. And I will be the co-moderator with all of my friends here of this session. So yeah.
My name is Dyami Luster. I'm an architect at Overland. I've been here for about 4 years.
And my name is Ureh Oguguo. I'm originally from Nigeria, moved here 5 years ago. Started at Overland as a design intern 4 months ago.
And then this young man to my left is the man, the myth, and the legend, Everett Fly, who, and I say that affectionately, he's a native San Antonian, an architect, a landscape architect, a 2014 National Humanities Medal Award winner, a pioneer in the field of historic preservation, and also a person that I consider a friend of mine and a mentor. So Everett, thank you for sitting down with us today. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be with all of you.
Did I miss anything? Because that was like a long list
No,
of
that's fine.
accomplishments. Do you think that's good? I mean, we can go on. I got 3 pages of stuff. Okay. So Dyami, do you want to tell us what we're talking about today?
Yeah, so we want to kick off this diversity in design thinking series by first talking about National African American History Month, or more commonly known as Black History Month. It's a month-long observance. There's a nose, but it initially started back in 1926 as Negro History Week, largely in part due to efforts by historian Carter G. Woodson. And when it initially started, it was the second week of February, and it was because the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass both fell during this week. And so for years, the Black community celebrated their birthdays. And so over time, over decades, it grew in popularity. And then in 1976, President Gerald Ford officially recognized Black History Month, and it's been a month we've observed ever since. So 2 things, and then we can get into it. I have just a couple initial thoughts. I think it's amazing that after all of these years, that we only stopped to acknowledge Black history essentially 1 month out of the year, right? There's 12 months and we get a month in it. I've always found it very interesting because so much of what Black history is, I think, ties into American history. And there's been numerous articles that have been posted online. There's been things that have been spoken about, and even I found a quote from Morgan Freeman once saying that Black history is American history. And so I guess just as we get started, do you all think this is true? I mean, do you think that just having just a month does it justice? Is it more of something we should be celebrating throughout the year?
Of course. Yeah. Absolutely.
Obvious question. Yes,
the obvious answer is yes. It's kind of like arguing against trees.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to argue against putting trees in green spaces because we understand that it's good for the environment. But Black history is fundamentally and critically tied to American history, and it's something that we don't discuss enough in schools or continue our education in it after we're out of school to kind of uncover and describe. There are a lot of hidden narratives and hidden stories that people like Everett seek to uncover and discover and preserve. And so I think it's fundamentally important.
I don't think that American history can be authentic if it doesn't include all the folks that contributed, all the folks that had roles to play. So as far as I'm concerned, if we don't include Black history, American history is just a fantasy. It's not real.
Speaking as someone who only knew about Black History Month 5 years ago when I moved to the US, I see your point with having, or with considering or basically thinking about Black History Month as 1 month versus shouldn't this be Black History Year every year? But then at the same time, I'm just speaking as an outsider basically. If every year is Black History Year, then every year will be Women's History Year, and every year will be Latin. Then there's no particular moment in time when you just appreciate one particular set of people. So I'm not like for it or for or against it, but like I see the point in it.
Yeah. I guess maybe it's yes, history is fundamentally tied, but also if you sort of section out a particular time, though it is the shortest month that we have in the year, and Dyami explained pretty well about how that came to be the case. But I do think it's for reverence, it's for respect to go ahead and cloister off some time to say, yes, it's fundamentally a part of American history, but also let's have like a moment of silence almost, except for it's
more
kind of the
concentrated version when you're focusing on just these particular issues and these particular people at the same time. Otherwise, it's just kind of spread across the year. Yeah. And you don't have that moment for reflection, like you said.
Right. The language is important to that too. I know we didn't get into it, but I think we can expand on it maybe a little bit.
I have a few thoughts about that. So, point two, and then I promise we'll get to the actual discussion. I don't want to derail too much, but I just want to put it out there that I never really liked being referred to as African American, because in one sense it implies that I have ties to Africa, and I get that we all of us do. We all came from at one point over there, but I think that I just don't identify with that in any sense anymore. I think I'm American. I don't think that I have to put a qualifier before that. There are a few other people groups that we have Mexican Americans, we have Chinese Americans, but you never see someone being referred to as a European American or French American. They're just seen as American. And so I think that kind of as I've gotten older and as I've just kind of thought about these things in general, just call me American, call me Black, call me Dyami. I'm human, right? But I don't. But I get that again. Language is important in that. So that's kind of my second point of just first range. So go off thoughts on that.
Well, it is like National African American History Month.
I know, but saying African American History Month to celebrate it this many years later, it's just like so much of it's just been. Again, it's been American history, right? And so I feel like the term African is no disrespected or anything at all, but I think that like it's American. And again, I get that there's been debates over the years of well, this isn't Black, this is a different color, this isn't that, but people don't identify as Caucasian American, they identify.
And I see it from like the other side. I'm seeing it from like not African side, and I'm seeing it from not American side, because when you call it African American History Month, then I don't know if I should be in the conversation. I feel like I should be like a bystander because I'm not African American and simply African. There's no blood or passport that identifies me as anything else besides Nigerian, besides Igbo, like my own ethnic identity. And African American History Month would take out the likes of Nelson Mandela or celebrating people like Fela Anikulapo Kuti and many other revolutionaries who contributed to Black history as we know it, who are not necessarily American. So I guess I see the controversy in language being important in that sense, that we're celebrating Black history. Are we celebrating Black history or are we celebrating African American history particularly? Because it becomes more specific when you specify it.
Let me ask you this. If someone would walk up to you and say, hey, you're African American.
I'll tell you, oh no, I might look African American, but I'm actually Nigerian. Yeah. And I've had to do that a couple of times because obviously we have similar experiences. I probably identify with more African Americans in America than I do with any other group of people in America. But doesn't make me African American. Most of the commonalities I have with African Americans are based on the color of my skin. Oh, we've experienced these same microaggressions, or we've experienced the same general experiences, not because I'm African American, or not because I'm African American, but because I'm Black. So I understand when people might mistake me for an African American because I'm an African in America, but I'm not. I'm actually just Nigerian. I always try to point it out, make the points to, and I've had people say things like, oh yeah, it's basically the same thing, like you're Black. I'm like, yeah, but Black comes in all different kinds of ethnicities and all different kinds of backgrounds. I could be Black and Caribbean, I could be Black and European, I could be Black and South African, but I'm Black and Nigerian. I'm just trying to, identify that, or like put myself back in that place.
Yeah.
This shows us how complex, all of this discussion and perception is.
Yeah.
When are you Black? When are you African?
Yes.
When are you American? And there's a lot of work that we all have to do, no matter what ethnicity you are, to see each one of us as a human being and a person.
First and foremost.
That's good, guys. That's good. So perhaps I think the greatest threat to Black history is the erasure of it. There are many different narratives that get discussed and sort of passed around, but the erasure of Black history was a critical component to the foundation of Black History Week back in 1926, and the major motivation for Godwin Woodson pushing the idea in the first place. So to celebrate and acknowledge it, I think we want to talk about that threat. So San Antonio, that's our home right now, that's where we are in the world, is a beautiful city. It has rich culture and history, but erasure or just plain leaving out of narratives happens across everybody's history. Black and minority histories, unfortunately, are disproportionately affected when we have that conversation, and that's true for most social issues. Black, brown, and the vast array of other people in between are almost always disproportionately affected by some of these things. So in San Antonio, I'm going to direct this to Everett. Where do you think that we currently fall on the spectrum? Are we doing pretty good when it comes to that subset of issues, or are we doing just terribly when it comes to that set of issues? And then tell us a little bit about your work and how it kind of seeks to solve the problem.
Well, San Antonio is, just in terms of demographics, is a very diverse city. Lots of different ethnic groups, thousands of years going back to indigenous cultures here, immigration of European traditions and cultures and people, exploration. San Antonio has a tremendous legacy in historic preservation, but in terms of preserving and combating the erasure issue, I'd have to say that San Antonio is seriously deficient. For example, recently we celebrated our tricentennial, 300 years of the establishment of the city of San Antonio. And as we look back across the range of resources that have been conserved and preserved, we've of course preserved missions like the Alamo and San Jose. We've conserved and preserved irrigation ditches, the acequias that serve those missions. We've conserved and preserved 20th century buildings. We even have roads, for example, the Camino Real, which was a main road that connected San Antonio to East Texas during Spanish colonial time. We preserved that. But in the 300 years of San Antonio, we've never preserved a 19th or early 20th century African-American resource. And that was pretty telling when I found that out for me. We have the mechanisms. The city has a very strong and positive historic preservation program. There's actually an Office of Historic Preservation It fits into our building codes and guidelines and regulations. There's all kinds of opportunities for it, but we simply haven't met the test in being equally as vigilant for African American resources. So my work deals with looking at the layers, all the different layers, no matter what ethnicity or where the origin of the people come from, looking at all the different layers that help or define a place, who laid out the roads, who protects the streams and the water, the natural resources. And so I try in my work to blend those together and find really critical overlaps and reinforce what's important to all of us, not just one group. Recently in San Antonio, I've been working with the African American history because, as I said, and Greg pointed out, so much of it has been lost, either to new highways. We've had neighborhoods lost because of the growth of hospitals. For example, the earliest black neighborhood was on the west side of the San Antonio River, approximately where the Santa Rosa Hospital sits today. And as Santa Rosa grew, it gradually moved and displaced that African American neighborhood. Some of the folks moved further west, some of them moved north, some of them moved east. And of course, the hospital has served us all. But we've lost so much. One of the important things that we still have are the histories, the memories, the recollections of people who still survive from some of those days. So we use a lot of oral history to help guide us, give us clues to what's significant, and even help us identify historic sites. So not only do I do the research, but I look for ways to physically conserve and interpret what we find into what could be considered modern planning and design.
One thing that I found really interesting about the work that you have done in San Antonio are the cemeteries. Not because I have some weird obsession with cemeteries,
Sure.
but because it's talking exactly or speaking directly to, in a very productive way, the kind of preservation that you were just telling us about.
Well, I agree with you, Greg. I didn't start out to document the cemeteries as landscapes, individual landscapes in themselves. I was looking for traces of settlements, black settlements and communities. And of course, when you establish a settlement, you build dwellings. Often following that, you build a church or a place for religious ceremony or celebration, a school, and then once you stay on that land long enough, people will pass away and you need a cemetery. And so looking back, trying to find the church or the school, they had been erased, but what was left were the cemeteries. And we began to actually find deeds for the cemeteries that specifically described them as African American or black or colored or Negro, whatever the term of the time would have been. And they're all in those deeds. And some of them are actually on some of the maps. There's some maps that we found that actually say Negro settlement or colored settlement. But as we began to work backwards, we found out that there were whole settlements, communities, sometimes 50 or 60 people surrounding those cemeteries. Today, many of them are surrounded by modern residential subdivisions. And so that presents us with an interesting interface or juxtaposition. You've got a 100-year-old or 120-year-old black cemetery right across the fence from a 20th century suburb and residential development. So then that gets you into all the planning dynamics of, how do you respect the current living residents, but also how do you respect that sacred ground that contains many generations of folks, and they paid honest, legitimate money for that land to establish the cemetery, so you can't discount it. And then, of course, we had state laws in Texas that protect a cemetery in perpetuity. So you might say, well, the cemetery might it's going to outlive several generations, and they have. So we've actually found families that didn't realize they were related. By doing the genealogy of the folks that are in the cemetery, we've found and brought branches of families together. We're actually working on one now that it is in a residential neighborhood, and looking at ways to reclaim it because it hadn't been cleaned up in 30 years, overgrown by wild vegetation, and that presents a whole other set of issues. So,
I just find that notion profound because I don't think that we kind of culturally think about cemeteries as anything else but sort of like someone's final resting place. You don't think about it as a remnant for tying the living together in the same way that you just described. So I think that just that thread in and of itself is like really, really profound. As a thought. So, okay, so we've been having lunch for, I don't know, for the past couple of years.
sure.
2 years.
And every time me and Dyami, we get in the car and we're like, man, that was such a great conversation. I really like having lunch with Everett. And then we go, what do we do with this now? How do you interact with people who try to claim that preservation in this sense, or interactions that you're having right now, that they're maybe irrelevant or not, the intention of it is not to sort of push us forward, but rather to keep us kind of constantly looking back. What would you say to people who kind of couch the conversation in that, or with people who will listen to this and will hear this and say, you know, preservation, I don't think that really has a place in kind of discourse or discussion right now if we're trying to think in a forward way. Like, we need to think about the future.
Well, there's several things that come to my mind, and I'm going to throw out a couple real quick and see if I can
Get a break.
get reaction from you all. Of course, the old cliche is that if you don't know your past or your past history, how do you know which way to go in the future? One twist on that is you should learn from the past and the mistakes in the past. And certainly there have been tragedies in American history, the way Black folks have been dealt with, oppressed, suppressed, etc. And if we're not aware of that, how do we go forward and not make the same mistakes in the future? And we can see that, and I've seen it recently in American history. The mistaken shootings of African Americans in supposedly someplace they're not supposed to be. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, being a Black architect, I have clients of all ethnicities, of all genders, but over the course of my time, there have been several times when I've been in a white neighborhood and have been stopped either by a municipal police officer, or in some cases in a gated community by a security officer, because I seemed out of place to them, a Black person in the middle of the day with a tape measure measuring in somebody's front yard, or
Right, because you're going to come move in.
Right. Either move in, or the suspicion is that you're casing the place so that you can come back later and rob it. And so, that just shows you that's a modern example that we have to deal with. And so I actually do, even today, when I have a client, and if it's in a predominantly white area, I do ask the client to let the neighbors know that I'm coming, because I'm coming to do my professional work, not for some criminal activity. But the other thought that about the relevancy, Greg, is of course I talked about or mentioned that subdivision earlier where there's an African American cemetery. And so by state law, that cemetery has to stay there in place. So the modern residents, one way or another, have to learn how to live with that, or if there's a change, consolidation of properties where properties are put together, or utility authority comes and says we need an easement, that black cemetery is a planning piece that has to be dealt with today and in the future. You can't just simply come with a bulldozer and pick up those graves. There's a whole process, and it would be very expensive to exhume each body one by one, verify and document who that is, and then find another place to reinter those remains. In urban design, one of my observations is that, and it shows up in San Antonio, because San Antonio has a very clear and pronounced legacy of craft trades, stonemasons, blacksmiths, carpenters, pottery, clay workers, artists, etc. African Americans were included, we found in our research, were included in those trades and vocations. But we don't see that expression come out in our modern design the way we see Spanish colonial references or German stonework references, etc. So if we, as designers, modern designers, are looking for new inspiration, new forms of design and expression, we're leaving out opportunities by ignoring the black trades, the black craftspeople that have come before us.
I have a question, just kind of going back to the story about the client that you had and that experience. Is that something, everyone can answer this, but is this something that you think it's a generational thing? Do you think it's something we'll ever grow out of as a profession, as a society? Or will that kind of stigma always remain, that there will be that kind of fear, if you will, or just discomfort? Because like you said, if you're just trying to do your professional work, this is how we make a living, this is what we do. And it amazes me now that even in 2019, or even whenever that story happened, that things like that still exist. And I guess my question is it ever gonna not be an issue as a society, as we continue progressing? We get to a point where that's not a problem anymore.
Well, I think if we don't address it directly, and we don't talk about it openly, I don't think we'll just grow out of it.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't ignore, how they say, it's the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
You can't ignore it.
Yeah.
And so I just think it's real important to be able to talk, and especially in multi-ethnic groups, civic groups, wherever you have the opportunity.
Right.
I think it's real important.
I agree with that 100%. I mean, I'm probably maybe a little bit more on the rougher end of that, and saying that as long as if I'm walking behind someone who doesn't look like me, and they're maybe clutching their purse a little bit tighter or walking a little bit faster, or I feel like I have to make extra noise or call extra attention to myself because as a black man in this space, my presence can be a threat, in and of itself. As long as we have that kind of inherent like fear or sensibility, and I think that's probably something that people don't even realize that they're doing.
Yeah.
It's like I sit on the bus. I can remember at UT, the University of Texas, riding on the bus, like the intercampus bus loop. The bus is packed. I'm sitting in a seat, like open, like looking at everybody, like please come sit next to me. The bus could be full, everybody standing up, nobody. Unless they had this skin that I have, would come and sit next to me, 9 times out of 10. Now, if we were like getting pushed out of the doors, then maybe, somebody would then come and sit down. But I think as long as we have that kind of systemic discrimination, then we're not gonna move anywhere very fast. I think you have to realize first that it's happening, and then decide to change your perspective.
Yeah, and I think most of us kind of have those inner thoughts at the beginning, like, I'm seeing a black person coming in. Oh, are they dangerous? But then we also have to catch ourselves when we have this kind of thoughts. Like, okay, what about this person? Are they holding a weapon? Maybe then they would be dangerous. What about this person is making me feel this way? And what does that say about me?
Right.
As opposed to, because it says more about the perpetrators than it does you seeing just
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, they definitely show you who they are in those moments.
Yeah.
But let's get back to Erasure, history, and communities. It's kind of, it kind of like goes in a circle.
I knew it was kind of, this was going to happen.
As it should. I love it. But when I think about, particularly Everett, your work in erasing in communities and history, I started to kind of look at the work that we do here at Overland and sort of analyze it critically in a way that maybe we don't always talk about in the office. But 1968 Hemisphere brought, people like to describe it as bringing, the whole world to San Antonio's doorstep. It was like a real energy infusion for civic and downtown San Antonio. But at the same time, the story that doesn't get told are, the thousands of people who were displaced as a result of that. And people from the most vulnerable communities were the ones that were being displaced. It wasn't, people who may be able to bounce back from that kind of uprooting.
I'm not very familiar with that project. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
So, in talking and discussing, kind of at 68 and learning a little bit more, watching videos and stuff, you realize that yes, it was kind of a fairground for a little bit, and then eventually the convention center got placed on it. We decided that the convention center was kind of like too big to be effective, tore down half of it to give it back to, the city as a public park. And then now our work is centered around bringing back some of the essence, of that original community, being residences and also local business, to come back, trying to, in a lot of ways, the way that I like to think about it is sort of restitch that seam that got kind of pulled apart whenever the original Hemisphere development was basically flattened to nothing. It displaced all those people to the east side and the west side and wherever else. But it was people from all different cross sections, Polish and Czech and Black people and people of Mexican heritage and Spanish people and kind of everything in between. But the reality is like it was people who were kind of on the margins and like a minority that were being affected by that. It's the story that doesn't really get told all that often, but I'm comforted to know that now we're able to go back and in our development sort of bring back some of the integrity to that space. So, okay, further expanding on question 1, how does erasure of history, communities, and lack of visibility then manifest itself in our day-to-day lives and in our actions with others, whether it be socially, kind of in our personal lives, or even professionally in a working environment? I think, Ureh, you had some pretty awesome thoughts about this.
In one way that I think it affects me, not just as a Black person, but as a woman and as a Black woman, or as a person who crosses a bunch of different minority intersections. There's this idea of tokenism where I have to decide, okay, am I called into the discussion, or am I called into this space to serve as a token, or are my ideas actually valued?
Right.
And it's kind of a battle because on one hand, basically tokenism, how I'll define it would be given the appearance of diversity, given the appearance of equality, without having to achieve those ideals. So without inclusion, you're taking my face, you're not taking my words. It's like the brochure cover for when you set up a new neighborhood,
Right.
and everybody looks like you want to be mixed up with them, but then when you actually go there, it doesn't look, it doesn't represent that. And I think sometimes people don't know that they're portraying these actions.
Sure.
They just think, oh, I'm checking off this box. It says it wants a woman. It says it wants a black person. It says it wants someone of an Asian descent, so that we look all mixed up. And when we take like a group family picture or a work picture,
It looks good.
it looks good.
Yeah.
But then the question that we should write, we're diverse. Are we diverse and inclusive, or are we just diverse to take the picture?
Yeah.
So
Everett, you have some pretty
yeah,
good opinions on that, especially when it comes to like checking boxes and
Yeah.
help requirements and everything else.
Well, sure, being a little bit older, I've come through different stages
Yeah.
of our society or culture trying to address that. And in the public sector, many municipalities trying to encourage minority participation have come up with what they call the set-asides. So on a municipal project, of course you have to have all your professional boxes to check, but then they want, do you have a woman-owned business to include? Do you have a minority business to include? And of course, the big team gets points towards the actual selection. And so generally, my experience has been on the short end of that, that I'm called when they're down to the 5%, and it's an arbitrary number. They're just trying to check that box irregardless of what skills or expertise I have to offer to the project. On the other side of that, what it actually did was encourage me to, instead of waiting for the system, so to speak, to work for me, start putting together my own teams so that I could be one of the leaders. I don't have to be the leader, but one of the leaders, so that I get a better fair share of the project, get to apply my skills and expertise, and it just commands more respect. So that's something that you folks as younger people will have to work towards, and I encourage you to do that. Is think about how you can build your own teams, build your own coalitions and networks,
and also remembering that in building our own per se, we should also consider including other voices.
Absolutely.
So we're not like continuing the thread.
Exactly. That's a very important point.
Yeah.
So what are some of the other things that sort of erasing history and the lack of visibility, like how they perpetuate themselves?
Well, it affects, in general, it affects community self-esteem. In other words, if whatever city you live in, you go somewhere and you say, I'm was from this neighborhood, but then the highway came and erased it, then you don't feel like your place in the community is that important.
Since it got erased.
I was recently in a conversation with some folks, and we were talking about, this is kind of unique to San Antonio. As you go around the social events, people will ask you, where did you go to high school? They don't, this is San Antonio thing, they don't always ask you, where did you go to college, but where did you go to high school? And of course, in San Antonio, as I've mentioned, with the disappearance of neighborhoods, several of what were black high schools have either been shut down or schools have been demolished. And so you say, well, you wouldn't know, but I used to go to such and such school, but it's gone. There's no sign of it. There's no school colors. There's no mascot. There's no expression. So self-esteem, it really does impact community self-esteem.
Kind of building on that, I think just thinking about communities and just the erasure of that. One thing that I'm drawn to when we talk about this discussion on this topic is the idea of gentrification. And I think it affects more than just the Black community. It affects multiple groups across San Antonio, across the nation, all around. But I think it's what's so fascinating is that our job as architects, we're kind of at a cross section, right? Where gentrification, one, is happening. People are developing land, doing things, and we're the ones getting paid to do it, right? So I think that it's a unique opportunity for us as things are happening, as things are developing, to recognize communities that might not be represented. But is there a way around gentrification? I mean, as cities continue to grow, as people continue to get displaced, as things are developed, is there ever a solution, or is it just a continuing cycle of people getting displaced, people getting erased, new communities coming in? Does it ever stop, or is it just something that's going to always keep happening, and we're the ones that are perpetuating the issue as architects, as designers, as urban planners? I don't have the answer, and I don't know what the answer is to that, but it's tough.
Again, I have a couple of thoughts. One is the gentrification can really be traumatic, again, for the community.
Right.
But as planners, designers, architects, I feel like whenever you have an opportunity to kind of represent that underrepresented voice, you kind of have a responsibility to do that. The other part, however, I put it on the community. The community has to do some work too. And a lot of times the communities that are displaced are working class communities. They don't have the time to go to all the public hearings. They don't have time to put the petitions together or circulate the information. But as designers or architects or planners, if we have a church group that we belong to or some other organization, it won't hurt us, like you were saying, Ureh, to share your thoughts and see if you can raise the consciousness of those groups so that they start to get involved. Because being proactive, especially in San Antonio now, at the rate we're growing, if you look around the developments, the infrastructure projects, the communities that are organized and show up at the meetings, at the council meetings, or let their representatives know, those are the ones that seem to come out better in than the displaced community.
Exactly. And I think also, just in the field, in the profession of architecture, generally speaking, a large majority of our job, and we talk about this every day, is coordinating.
Right.
We coordinate disciplines. Community engagement and all of the things kind of surrounding it is part of our job. It's part of the coordination process. And I think unless we start to think about it that way and think about our job is sort of a little bit of a scope, creep, I guess, whenever we talk about it from this perspective. But yes, it's definitely fundamental to sort of the cultural and the societal components that we have to deal with. And I think that we should be treating it just like we treat an MEP engineer or a structural engineer or anything. It is like fundamentally tied to the health, safety, and welfare of people. And unless we start to develop, kind of that perspective and that position, that people in the community, they are our clients too, just as much as the person who's paying for the structure or for the landscape or for whatever it might be. So we have a responsibility to them to do our due diligence as well. I think there's probably some other issues that we can talk about. One thing that I had in mind also was imposter syndrome. Like when you've been displaced from a community and the community, let's say the community gets gentrified, you go back to that place, all of a sudden you don't belong in that space anymore.
Right.
You're like, do you know that like generations of my family, my ancestral history have been tied to this place, and just because some of the buildings have changed their makeup a little bit, all of a sudden I don't belong here.
Right.
And it's unfortunate. I think a lot of us are used to walking into spaces just because in the professional world, you know, Black and brown people don't make up a significant percentage of that. Walking into rooms where we're the only one. You might be the only woman. You may be the only Black
Only
woman.
Black woman.
You may be the only, figure of a different makeup and identity that some of these people get to see. And you have to deal with sort of the trauma that is caused by that, and always sort of having to be the pillar and hold up the end and the perspective for everybody who looks like you. Like all of that weight is all of a sudden can be, on your shoulder. It's an unreasonable.
Yeah, and one thing I've noticed is you don't get to be an individual in a space like that. You don't get to be. I don't get to be Ureh, or I don't even get to be the Nigerian girl. I get to be Black women. But no, it's like, and this is something I've experienced in so many different spaces where that has been the case for me. Oh, can I touch your hair? No, I don't like
I
you
don't
to touch
think
my
so.
hair. Oh, but Desiree likes it when I touch her hair. And
I'm
like,
not Desiree.
that's the only
This is
other
not a
person-
monolith.
The only other person we have in common who is a mutual friend of us who looks like me. Basically, the only other Black person you know likes it when you touch your hair. Same, okay, you like it when I poke your forehead. Maybe somebody else does. Maybe somebody else that looks like you does. But does that mean I can go to you and poke your forehead?
Right.
So it's just a bunch of, if you're being serious, and that was super serious, a bunch of microaggressions that exist within communities and experiences that apply specifically to those experiences that exist within say a particular group of people. Like if something happens or someone said something and it's offensive, and all the Black people will look at themselves like,
Did
sometimes it even gets more specific. Say all the Black women look at yourself, look at them and then I'm looking around the office like, oh dang it.
There's nobody to look at to.
No, but yeah, that just goes into having discussions outside of your group, because what can I do about being the only Black person in the room?
Yeah.
I'm not there's nothing, well, if there's something, let me know. Right?
Please do tell.
Right?
Yeah.
But it goes into how everybody else behaves. Basically, it's not a conversation I can even have in this room because you guys get it. It's a conversation about the people that don't get it.
Exactly.
And mostly the people who are actually not ill-intentioned. They actually have good intentions, or they actually have sincere curiosities that I don't want to have to deal with, but I can't oppose without being, or I can't openly oppose without seeming off. It's like, oh, I don't understand.
Right.
Which is the thing.
Right.
It's like, of course I'm going to touch your hair. I don't understand why I won't touch your hair. Because of who I am as a person.
Because I don't want you to touch my hair.
So I'm like, it's like that, and I get those curiosities, and obviously I'm constantly dealing with how to battle that in a way that is more understanding and not losing my temper, because being not Ureh in many spaces and being Black women, if I lose my temper, I'm Black women.
Right.
That's what just
all
happened.
Of a sudden,
I just turned into a stereotype. Right? My individuality is basically erased from that situation.
Right.
And now everybody else that saw that happen will look around the room and will look around the environment and be like, oh, yeah, I kind of expected. Or they'll look at maybe another Black woman who got in the same situation that I was in, who lost their temper. And they're like, makes sense.
Yeah.
Trend.
You're right. So I try as much as possible, which is as much as you try to be yourself and be your true authentic self, there's still a filter.
Well, again, being a little bit older, I completely understand all of those things. But what I would encourage Ureh, for you to do, since you made that point, is you've already, by being at the level you are now, and you're already highly professional. You're already extremely unique. We didn't create, Black folks didn't create this profession of architecture as we know it in America, but I'm thoroughly convinced, and I've had some good mentors along the way, that we can do it. And it's one of those things that if you get to the level that you guys are, you can do it. All you need to do is just be yourself. Just keep working at what you work at. The other folks, you can't control them. You can't control their lack of respect. You can't control their intellect, however high or low it is. But you can hold your place and just keep moving through it. And you build experiences, like you guys keep talking, keep reading. I kind of caught the tail end of it, but when I came along, you'd have to write a letter to a friend and say, you wouldn't believe what. Wait for a response.
Weeks and weeks
Right,
and weeks.
and if that friend wasn't right there where you were, then you guys can get on whatever, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, etc., and get a response. And I think it's great that we have that, because you can talk to people back in Nigeria, or wherever you have comrades or camaraderie, and get that.
No, it's actually just people here, because in Nigeria, racism is not technically the problem there. I think there are other problems.
Sure.
Because we're like the blackest nation in the world. So everybody looks like you. That's like nothing has to. So those are not experiences my friends back home would technically identify with.
Yeah.
Right.
And Everett, I think you're right. You can't control people's ignorance, but I do think it's incumbent on us to maybe address some like things that we typically see over and over again to happen. Like for me, one of the things that I have to resist sort of engaging in the workplace is if someone says like, I don't see color, or we all bleed the same, or something kind of along those lines. I think on one hand, I think I put it on myself first, and I go, I have done a bad job showing you who I am, is the first thing that I think.
No.
And then I also think, but also that statement in and of itself lets me know that you don't see me.
Yes.
Because by you saying that you don't see color, you have erased all of the baggage that this skin that I have brings with me. Whether I step fully into that understanding or not is sort of irregardless of the fact. It's like you have taken away that historical context that is necessary to understand every single part of my identity and when I interact with you. And so in a lot of ways, I find that statement very problematic. And I've had people, say it to me. And I think that this is the perfect kind of opportunity to say, like,
See color, respect
you should see color,
yes.
You should respect it, and you shouldn't cop out, for lack of a better phrase.
It's not a bad thing.
Yeah, you shouldn't.
Yeah.
You shouldn't say that. Because basically, what you're saying is your history isn't important enough for me to have an understanding of it to then see you fully.
Yeah.
And that's problematic for many different reasons.
Do you think that when, first of all, yes. Let me say yes. Do you think that in situations like that where someone might say that to you, that to say, oh, I don't see color, but I just want to see you as like human. Like there's a side that they're trying to hit that just, again, it's good intentions, but like incredibly poor execution in the way that it's conveyed. Not that everyone, that's the case with everyone, but I feel like maybe sometimes people in doing that want to not dwell on the past, or kind of
Right,
like see
right.
for who you are in
I want to
2019?
make a point
Right.
as to say,
Is it more of an
Yeah.
equality thing, or is it like still actually you're still missing the point here?
yeah,
There's some nuance there, but I think that you have to both take into consideration the intent as well as the result.
yes,
You can have, like you said, you can have the best of intentions, but if the result of your intent
yeah,
is that the way that I am perceiving it is
Yeah.
a certain way, then you
Yeah.
need to shift
that's like
the
the
way that
basis
you're.
of,
Yeah.
I guess, where a character exists. Because impact is always more visible and more effective than intent. Always, always, always. No one cares that you had good intentions. They only care how you made them feel or what you
The
said
impact
to
that you
them,
had.
the impact you had in them. So, the intent.
Snaps for
One quick story.
Yeah.
When I finished architecture school, I was 23, and I went immediately to graduate school. And as you would know, I went to graduate school at Harvard, and my class, the group that came in with me was about 35 or 36 students, but they were from all over the world. One of my classmates was from Lagos. One of my classmates was from Sao Paulo. One of my classmates was from Bangkok, and then
Yeah.
the rest of the United States. And so they put us together, in a very tight-knit group. And I guess it's about 50-50 men and women. And I want to say probably after the second semester, we were in studio one day, and one of my classmates, a white woman, we were just talking, and she said, Everett, I'm really glad I got to meet you. And she went on to say, she said, you're the first Black person that I've ever had to see every day in my life. And I said, where are you from? And she said, I'm from Utah. Now think about the demographics of Utah.
Yeah.
It wasn't her fault that she was just born there.
Right.
Yeah.
And the demographics of that area, there's very few Black people that you would get to see. And we still communicate. So I didn't take it negatively, but I had to think, like you all were saying about, okay, now what does she mean by this? But she was very sincere. And again, think about the time, we're talking 1975, 76, in there, the things that were going on socially and politically and so forth, that you're seeing in the world. And so a lot of what her perception of a Black woman or a Black man, or was coming from the news or the TV or filtered some other way. But she was saying that was the first time in her life. And by the way, I was 25, she was 32. She was some years older
Right.
than me. And then after I thought about it, I said, gosh, how would I feel? It's like I feel deprived if I had gone through my whole life and hadn't seen people of other
Yeah.
color.
Like,
you know.
dang it.
I'm encouraged by actually, seriously, the presence of you young people. When I graduated in 1975 and came back to San Antonio, there was one Black architect. Just the folks in this room is a 400%.
Increase. How long did that take?
Increase. And then if you add the folks the other African-American architects and engineers that are not in this room,
Sure.
right
Yeah,
this
yeah.
second, it's close to 1,000% increase. And so you do have to have numbers in order to help be effective. The numbers help support one another.
Right.
So that would be my call to action, is that we be proactive in whatever we do. We support one another, that one Black architect, that was Marcel Haywood. And you can only imagine what he had to go through to try to get support and get people to back him and use his services. And so I would encourage you all to support one another. The other folks that aren't here, support them as well, and tie in the other calls to action that you've outlined, and we'll move forward.